Good day. Over the last 24 hours, the event which I've long discussed, and to some extent you could almost say predicted, that my colleague and I, Alex Christoforou, have discussed regularly on the Duran, which has been discussed and predicted by many, many other people, an American military strike in the Middle East, a big public American military strike in the Middle East, finally happened with the American and British missile and bomb strikes on the Houthis, Ansar Allah, in Yemen. Well, I think there's a number of points which I would like to make first before I proceed with a discussion of this event. The first is that these were large-scale, very visible strikes. They were accompanied with statements from Admiral Kirby at the National Security Council, by statements from the Pentagon itself, by statements from President Biden. The British government has weighed in. The governments, in other words, that conducted these strikes have been very public in declaring them. But it would be actually a mistake to think that these strikes are taking place in a completely calm environment in which the United States has not been actually conducting military strikes of various kinds for quite a great extent over the last few weeks. Now, I've already actually mentioned in previous videos how there have been American airstrikes. These have been conducted in response to attacks by militias, armed militias, on American bases in Iraq and Syria. There have been several such strikes on militia positions by the United States. These latest strikes by the United States on the Houthis are essentially part of that same pattern. And I would quickly add that on top of the strikes that the United States has been conducting under the radar for some time, Israel has been conducting strikes of its own. They've been launching missile strikes in Lebanon, in Syria, increasingly in Syria. There have been, of course, assassination attempts of Iranian officials and members of the leadership group of the Hamas organization that Israel is fighting in Gaza. So again, it's not quite correct, as I think many people believe, that these strikes, these missile strikes and bomb strikes by the United States and Britain have come out of a clear blue sky. There's been a steady build-up towards this for some time. What is different is that those earlier strikes by the United States were happening under the radar, so to speak, whereas these latest strikes were carried out in a very public way, above the radar. That's one thing I wanted to say. The second is, of course, that there has to be some questions about the legality of these missile and bomb strikes. The United States did not go to the UN Security Council. The UN Security Council has a general responsibility for preserving peace. What is happening in the Red Sea, you could argue, is a threat to peace. In fact, you couldn't just argue it. It clearly is a threat to peace. I'm not talking about the latest strikes. I'm talking about the acts by the Houthis against commercial shipping and all those sort of things. The United States, the Western powers, other countries could have gone to the Security Council, discussed at the Security Council the general situation in the Red Sea, worked with the other members of the Security Council to try find a way forward that might have included security measures in the Red Sea. That would have been the lawful diplomatic, appropriate thing to do. Of course, the United States didn't do that. It just sent its ships to the Red Sea and launched its missile strikes against the Houthis. It acted, in other words, to all intents and purposes, on its own, unilaterally. Now, the United States can argue, perhaps with some justification, that in launching these attacks, it is exercising some kind of self-defense role. After all, the Houthis have made threats against not just American and Western commercial shipping, but also even against American warships. But to be frank, I think this would be a difficult argument to push were it ever to go to a court of law, which of course it won't. The key point is not the fractured legality of this move. We've had lots of moves, actions like this by the United States over many decades now. It is again the fact that the United States chooses to act on its own. It doesn't consult, it doesn't engage in a diplomatic process. And it's not difficult to understand why it did not go to the Security Council to seek agreement and authorization from the Security Council to do whatever it wants to, whatever it felt was it needed to do in the Red Sea. Because, of course, over the last few weeks, ever since the Hamas incursion into Israel on the 7th of October, the United States has been vetoing one resolution after another in the Security Council relating to the conflict in Gaza. And, of course, the conflict in Gaza and the problems in the Red Sea are intimately interconnected. The Houthis are saying that they're taking the actions that they are in the Red Sea because of the conflict in Gaza. And I don't think anybody seriously questions that this is the case. And the United States, therefore, didn't want to go to the Security Council to discuss the situation in the Red Sea, because had it done so, then more than likely the other members of the Security Council would have said, well, in that case, if you want us to authorize action that you want to take in the Red Sea, then we really do need to discuss and talk about the situation in Gaza as well. And given that these two conflicts are closely interconnected with each other, we should really get a ceasefire in Gaza. Because there is another reason why the United States did not go to the Security Council. And that is that for the United States to go to the Security Council to seek authorization from the Security Council before it makes a move like the one it has just made, well, that would in effect amount to an admission by the United States that there is some legal authority beyond the United States itself that has or should have some say over American decisions. And of course, the United States, seeing itself as the exceptional country that sees further and stands higher than other countries, those words by Madeleine Albright spoken way back in the 1990s, well, of course, it doesn't want to acknowledge that there are any restraints on its behaviour at all. And if you want to understand the difference between international law and the rules-based international order, there you have it. The rules-based international order is what the United States decides that it wants to do from one day to another. If the United States does it, it's legal. That's basically the conception behind the rules-based international order. International law is this old-fashioned idea that there are rules binding on everybody, including the United States, which is why you should go to the Security Council first. The United States will not accept that, and that is a major cause of the instability and disruption that we see in the world today. But anyway, I just wanted to make those points because in all the commentary, in all the discussion, in all the things that get written about this latest strike on Yemen, these two things get overlooked. Anyway, let's move on. Let's actually discuss the strikes itself. Let's ask ourselves, why have they happened and what are they going to achieve? Now, the strikes are described as sending a message to the Houthis. They're also described, by the way, as sending a message to Iran. Now, what they actually do is that they create conditions for an escalation of the conflict in the Middle East. For that precise reason, and because many people in the Middle East are already very angry about the situation in Gaza and see these moves as unjustified and see the United States in effect now taking action in Gaza, in Yemen, which parallels the action that Israel is taking in Gaza and basically further aligns the United States with Israel in these conflicts which across the Middle East are deeply unpopular. Well, for that reason, this latest action by the United States is deeply unpopular across the Middle East. And we've had statements to this, comments, acknowledgements of this. Even, for example, from the New York Times. The New York Times, there's an article today, which says that there's been criticism of this American move, this missile strike, even from some of America's allies in the Middle East. And that, of course, is correct. Some countries which are nominally allied to the United States, but which are perhaps less generally aligned than they once were, are more openly critical. President Erdogan of Turkey is out there making extraordinarily passionate speeches denouncing what the Americans are doing. I don't think that is particularly consequential myself, what Erdogan says, but anyway, there has been much criticism of this move across the Middle East, around the global south, not just, of course, in the Middle East. The Russians have condemned it. The Chinese have indicated that they disapprove. Much of the global south indicates that they disapprove, partly because it is, as I said, a unilateral measure by the United States, and also, of course, because the United States is aligning with Israel and taking military action alongside Israel in the Middle East. But there are nonetheless explanations, in a sense, that go beyond the actual problems with the shipping in the Red Sea, which point to something else, and something which I think is what is causing growing alarm internationally. Because the United States supposedly has been working very hard over the last couple of weeks to try to contain the conflict in the Middle East, to try to limit it to Gaza itself. Well, here we have Lord Cameron, the British Foreign Secretary, former Prime Minister, and Lord Cameron has been making statements like this. He says the British strikes in Yemen send a very clear message to Iran. The Foreign Secretary, that's Lord Cameron, vowed that Britain would do what is necessary to end Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, as he drew a distinction between the overnight strikes and the Israeli-Hamas conflict. And Lord Cameron told NBC that warning after warning has been given, and yet the attacks continued. The very clear message was, if you act in this way, there aren't just warnings, there are consequences. And we also learned that a NATO spokesman has said that Iran has a special responsibility to rein in its proxies. Proxies, of course, meaning the Houthis in Yemen. Now, what is actually going to happen? We've had a missile and bomb strike on Houthi positions in Yemen. Now, the Houthis are one of the toughest, most hardened militia groups, not just in the Middle East, but probably in any part of the world. They've been involved in conflicts and wars in Yemen for decades. They've fought a long war against Saudi Arabia, which was backed by the United States and the Western powers. They've had to endure sea blockades by the Saudis and their allies. They've had to endure airstrikes by the Saudi Air Force, equipped with American-supplied F-15 fighter jets. This has been going on for years after years, with the United States heavily involved behind the scenes. And the Houthis have survived, and they've prevailed against all of that. Now, a number of things flow from this. Such a hardened, disciplined organization, one which clearly does have a significant amount of support within Yemen itself, amongst people in Yemen. Is it realistic to think of it as just a proxy of Iran? Proxies generally have shallow support within the nation in which they are located, because of course the people of that nation quickly figure out that this is just a proxy, that the conflicts that they're being led into are not conflicts that are ultimately conducted in their interests. They are being conducted on behalf of the sponsor, who might be located far away. The fact that the Houthis have been able to go on fighting, win most of their battles, win in fact all of their battles, gain effective control of most of Yemen, establish as a tough military organization, all that argues strongly against them being just a proxy of Iran. And are the very tough, very hardened men who lead the Houthis simply proxies, likely to be simply proxies of Iran? Aren't they the sort of people who, having fought in many wars and faced immense risks, will have developed a certain self-confidence and have ideas of their own? The Iranians certainly do possess influence over the Houthis, but it is most unlikely that the Iranians can simply control them as proxies. So that is the first thing. The second is that when dealing with such a tough and hardened organization, are a couple of missile and airstrikes really going to impress them or deter them in any meaningful way. Now, I'm not familiar with the war, every aspect of the war between the Saudis and the Houthis. The one that went on, as I said, for pretty much 10 years. What I do recall is that the Houthis would be continuously bombed by the Saudis. I suspect that pretty much every single base and facility that was attacked by the United States and Britain in the overnight strikes will have been attacked by the Saudis already. In fact, I saw one report which said that one particular airbase which the US attacked in the missile strikes overnight, that this had been attacked by the Saudis and bombed by the Saudis on no fewer than 15 occasions, and that the Saudis had on 3 occasions announced that this particular base had been destroyed. I've been reading that the Houthis, over the many long years of their conflict with Saudi Arabia, have hardened their industrial facilities, moved many of them underground, and of course anybody who knows anything at all about the geography of Yemen knows that this is a difficult mountainous country, not easy to control from outside, with plenty of places in which an organisation like the Houthis can hide. Now, is it really likely that an organisation like this, possessed of those kind of assets, located within this kind of geography, and with this background and experience behind it, is going to be deterred or impressed by a few missile and bomb strikes? Isn't it, in fact, actually more likely that one of the reasons why the Houthis were conducting more and more attacks on commercial shipping, despite getting all of these warnings from the United States, is precisely because at some level they were actually willing or daring the United States to launch attacks on them, because they know perfectly well that they can absorb those attacks. Now, there's a lot of speculation about what the Houthis are going to do, and the Houthis are issuing statements that they're going to take strong retaliatory measures, and people are talking, some people have been talking about more attacks on American bases across the Middle East. That is quite likely, and about the Houthis attempting to attack American warships and perhaps British warships in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Oman and elsewhere. About the attacks on the warships, I am much more sceptical. I think the Houthis understand that they don't have the technical methods, the means to attack those warships. I am not saying that, by the way, with any certainty or confidence. I don't know the full extent of the Houthis' capabilities. But I would have thought that, say, attacking an American destroyer, an Aegis-class destroyer, is perhaps beyond the capabilities that the Houthis have at this present time. But why would they need to do that anyway? These attacks, supposedly, are intended to deter the Houthis from launching attacks on commercial shipping in the Red Sea. What if the Houthis simply respond to these attacks by redoubling their attacks on the commercial shipping in the Red Sea? What if they have already calculated, as I said previously, that they can absorb the damage done to them by these missile and bomb strikes, and that by defying the US and launching more attacks on commercial shipping in the Red Sea, they call, in effect, the American bluff, exposing the United States as being weaker than it is, as being unable ultimately to control the security situation in the Red Sea. Well, that would be a very difficult situation for the United States. It's very difficult to see what the United States would do in that case. I have read one article somewhere about the possibility of sending ground troops into Yemen to try to take on the Houthis in that way. I think that would be a disastrous idea. I think the Pentagon would be strongly opposed. I think many people within the Democratic Party in the United States would be extremely strongly opposed to any such move. I would add that for the British to send troops alongside the United States into Yemen would be a particularly disastrous idea, though I have not seen it mentioned in a single commentary or article I've read in the British media, which is extraordinary, actually. The reality is that southern Yemen, the area around the port city of Aden, was a British colony until the late 1960s. Aden was a major British naval base. The British had a military presence in Yemen, one that became increasingly unpopular with the local people. The result was an insurgency against the British in the late 1960s, which forced the British, at that time arguably a more powerful country militarily than they are today, forced the British to withdraw. And I would have thought that the very last thing the British would want to do is to go back to Yemen, relive that rather sad episode, sad from a British point of view, of their late imperial decline and fall, and experience all the bitterness and defeat that would come if they went there again. And of course, for the Houthis, for the Yemenis, seeing the former imperial power return, well, of course, that would probably be another factor that would rally them behind the Houthis even more. So any idea of sending ground troops really makes absolutely no sense. So what do? You go on launching more and more missiles, more and more rockets at the Houthis in Yemen, expecting that is somehow going to change the situation. What if it doesn't? What if the Houthis continue to absorb all of these blows and continue to attack commercial shipping in the Red Sea? What if, in fact, they intensify their attacks? Again, I'm not at all familiar with the Houthis' capabilities, but what if they find some means to intensify their attacks on the shipping? What if the situation with the shipping just goes on getting worse? You can't go on launching missiles continuously and achieving no results. That is embarrassing. It highlights your weakness. You can't realistically send ground troops against the Houthis in Yemen because of all the problems I said. The fact that this is a tough organization. It's got tens of thousands of fighters. The country is mountainous. They would have the support of nearly most of the local people, probably all of them, in fact. It would be a disastrous mistake to try to do something like this. So what ultimately do you do? Well, as I said, Lord Cameron has given us the answer. It's not just the Houthis, it's Iran. You're giving a very clear message to Iran, and the NATO spokesman has told us that Iran has a special responsibility to rein in its proxies. The Houthis, in other words, are relegated, at least rhetorically, into a proxy of Iran. If you can't defeat the Houthis, then go after Iran instead. And of course, there have been endless demands from all sorts of people, going back decades now, people like Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel, people like John Bolton in the United States, people like assorted neocons in Britain. The Daily Telegraph is populated with people like this. All of them pressing for years and years for that missile strike, that bombing offensive against Iran, which, for reasons completely unknown to me, they seem convinced will transform the entire situation in the Middle East, perhaps in Iran itself, but which might also, they think, cause the Iranian government to fall. So, one way or the other, this latest move, ill thought out, unplanned that it is, conducted, as I said, in a hole-in-the-corner fashion, without the Security Council being consulted, this move is taking us one big further step towards that ultimate confrontation with Iran, which, on every principle of geopolitics, the United States and Britain, bogged down as they are in this conflict in Ukraine, which they are losing, with the situation in the Asia-Pacific region likely to deteriorate further, especially following the elections in Taiwan this weekend, well, they ought to be doing everything they possibly can to avoid. But inexorably, relentlessly, we seem to be moving ever further and closer to that point. And we can already see the alibis starting to be cobbled together. There's an article in The Guardian today by Julian Borger in The Guardian, and we're told that the strikes on Houthis could bring Biden closer to the regional war he sought to avoid. And we read things like this. When Joe Biden gave the order for airstrikes on Houthi targets in Yemen, he was taking a step that now imperils one of the primary aims of his own Middle East policy to prevent a regional war. US and allied officials argue he had little choice. Diplomacy, backdoor channels, signalling and threats had failed to halt relentless Houthi attacks on shipping in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden, which the Iranian Ba'ath Group has claimed are being carried out in solidarity with Gaza. Well, can I say straight away, this is an alibi. Let's just look at those words again. US and allied officials argue Biden had little choice. Diplomacy, backdoor channels, signalling and threats had failed to halt relentless Houthi attacks on shipping in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. What diplomacy? What diplomacy of any kind has there actually been? The United States refuses to acknowledge that there is any link between the events in the Red Sea and the events in Gaza. We've had more statements to that effect from Lord Cameron. We are told that the Foreign Secretary, I think this is from the Daily Telegraph, the Foreign Secretary vowed that Britain would do what is necessary to end Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, as he drew a distinction between the overnight strikes and the Israel-Hamas conflict. So we pretend that these two conflicts are somehow completely separate from each other, that they happen in entirely separate, even if parallel universes, which is an absurd idea. So we won't recognize that there is this connection. And in light of the fact that we refuse to recognize that connection, we are reduced not to diplomacy in any meaningful sense, but through those backdoor channels to signalling and threats, because that's all we have. We're not giving the Houthis any reason to discontinue what they're doing. We're not giving the Iranians any reason to talk to the Houthis to get them to discontinue doing what they're doing. All we can do is signal our threats to them, because the one thing that might conceivably have caused the Houthis to desist, or might conceivably have caused the Iranians to put real pressure on the Houthis to stop doing what they're doing, which is a ceasefire in Gaza, is something which the United States and Britain have set their face against. So it all comes down just to signalling and threats. No diplomacy at all. Warnings, we're told there have been many of them. In fact, The Guardian has provided us with a whole timeline of warnings that the United States has been giving to the Houthis, warnings which the Houthis, as I said, have ignored. But let me repeat again, simply giving warnings is not diplomacy. Diplomacy is trying to understand the other side's perspectives and working towards finding some common position. There has been none of that, because in Gaza, over the Gaza conflict, the United States and Britain have shown no ability to budge at all. They continue largely to follow in the wake of where Prime Minister Netanyahu is taking them. And that, again, brings me to the underlying problem. Now, as I've said many times, the reason we are where we are is because of that disastrous set of decisions which were taken by the Western powers, primarily by the Biden administration, primarily by the president himself, back in October, shortly after the Hamas attack on Israel. I have expressed myself in very critical terms about that Hamas attack. I know many people have sought ways to justify or defend it. I have not done either of those things. I think Hamas should be told by the UN Security Council to release its hostages. And in fact, the Security Council has attempted to do that. I think there ought to be an investigation to find out what happened. I am prepared to accept that Hamas officials have engaged in war crimes and other things. But the fact is that launching a huge military operation in Gaza to try to defeat Hamas was as misconceived as these attacks on Yemen are going to prove to be. There was never any real possibility, in my opinion, that Israel would be able to defeat Hamas within any kind of achievable time frame. We are weeks away from the start of the Israeli military operation. Tens of thousands of civilians have been killed in Gaza. There's arguments endlessly about the exact number, but everybody accepts that lots of civilians have died. Everybody accepts that most of those civilians, or at least many of them, have been minors. Large numbers of buildings have been destroyed in Gaza. There's been an effective blockade of Gaza. There is, in effect, a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. And this has had a massive negative effect across the Middle East, across the global south. We now have a case against Israel in the International Court of Justice. I've now followed the, I thought, very powerful submission that the South African lawyers, backed by Ireland, by the way, brought to the International Court of Justice. I have been, to be frank, deeply unimpressed by the counter-arguments presented by the British lawyer who is representing Israel. I don't actually think that these arguments, legally speaking, were arguments at all. And the West has found no means to get off this train that they clambered onto back in October when they decided to give Israel the green light to start that huge military operation in Gaza. I said that there were other things that could have been done. I've spoken about how, again, the United States, Israel, other friendly countries could have presented requests to the Security Council for action, which might have led to the release of the hostages, to investigations, to all of those sort of things. Of course, that was never even considered. And so, as a result, we've had this military campaign in Gaza. There are reports from Israel now that thousands of Israeli soldiers have been wounded. I'm not going to indulge in trying to guess figures. I've seen all kinds of figures for the numbers of Israeli soldiers who've been wounded. The Israeli media is full of these stories. I'm not confident about any one of these numbers, but anyway, the fact is the military campaign continues. Hamas is still there. It is still fighting. It continues to launch rocket attacks on Israel, and it still holds its hostages. And the result is, with that war going on, other actors, the Houthis in Yemen, conceivably Hezbollah eventually, the militias in Iraq and Syria, have been reacting, as it was inevitable eventually that they would. And to compound all of these problems, even as we start with missile strikes on Yemen, which as night follows day, are going to lead us to that disastrous outcome of a missile strike on Iran. We also have now demands for a renewal of the conflict against Hezbollah in the north, despite in the northern border of Israel, moving troops from Israel into Lebanon, engaging the Hezbollah militia, another incredibly tough, battle-experienced organization, in another prolonged war, which the Defense Intelligence Agency in the United States is warning could stretch Israeli resources beyond breaking point. It is very difficult, looking at all of this, to see any coherence to US and Western policy in the Middle East. Instead, one gets the sense of an administration that is reacting, that is always one step behind events, and is being led by events, and which, whenever it has to make a choice between diplomatic outcomes and military ones, always ends up taking the military ones, which invariably make its ultimate situation even worse. I have to say, today, even all of these events that we're seeing play out now have been completely foreseen by me. I mean, this has not been, I've not, by the way, exercised any startling insight here. All you have to do was to listen to the kind of statements the members of the administration have been making, the members of the Israeli government have been making. Look at the pattern of US behavior in the Middle East. Look at the pattern of Israeli behavior whenever Israel has felt challenged. Anyway, even as one could see this whole thing playing out, one gets almost the sense that one is watching a train hurtling towards the precipice, and there doesn't seem to be any ability to stop it or to slow it down or to get the driver to listen and persuade him to put a little pressure on the brake. Well, there we are. Now we'll see what happens next. As I said, I think more likely than not, the Houthis, who are, amongst other things, a highly intelligent organisation. I think this is another major mistake, by the way, Western policymakers make. I think they consistently underestimate the intelligence and sophistication of their adversaries in Yemen, Gaza, Lebanon, and of course Iran. Even, as I said, I'm convinced that the Houthis, intelligent organisation, clever people as they are, they're going to calibrate their response in a way which will be most effective for them, which will enable them to gain the most leverage internationally and to embarrass the United States most publicly, without at the same time having to exert themselves in a way that might leave them overextended. And my guess is that what we will see is not, as I said, attacks on American warships, but more attacks on commercial shipping in the Red Sea. So that's my thoughts about these events today. I say all of this with deep foreboding, with great gloom. It seems, as I said, that whenever there's a choice between war and peace, policymakers in Washington and London invariably choose war over peace. Once more, I find myself completely unable to understand what the British government thinks it's doing, why it thinks that sending 4 Typhoon fighters to drop bombs is going to make any difference, given the overwhelming discrepancy in power between the United States and Britain. I mean, it's not as if those 4 Typhoons are adding anything of any importance to this operation. The state of the British military is parlous. I've been reading recent reports in the British media that warships have had to be scrapped because the Royal Navy can't find recruits to join it. This is in Britain. But nonetheless, it seems that like Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, Britain has to play Sancho Panza to America's Don Quixote, even as the Americans tilt at the windmills of all of these Houthi bases, which, as I said, they will never be able to destroy. The British have to join in, even in a part of the world where they've had a bad history and would be wise to stay out. But there we are. That's all I'm going to say about this today. I've been perhaps a little more emotional than usual. I apologise for that. But as I said, it's sometimes very discomforting to see things that you've anticipated happen, especially when they turn out to be the very things that you've dreaded most. Let's move to this other war that continues to be played out, which is the conflict in Ukraine. Now, I was talking yesterday about a lull in the fighting. My sense is that that lull is now indeed coming to something of an end. And there's been quite a lot of reports over the last couple of hours about various Russian moves in various places on the battlefronts. Let's start with the Dnieper River, the Krinky area. Lots of reports now of heavy Russian airstrikes on Ukrainian positions on the west bank of the Dnieper. I discussed how a few weeks ago, after the Ukrainians moved air defense missiles to the west bank of the Dnieper and shot down at least one Sukhoi 34 jet, perhaps more, but that's never been confirmed, how the Russians for a short time stood down their air force in this area. But it's clear now that the Russians have successfully defeated the air defense system that Ukraine was trying to build on the west bank of the Dnieper, and airstrikes have now resumed with a vengeance. And Dima at the Military Summary Channel has now told us that they are now attacking the Ukrainians on the west bank of the Dnieper with 1,500 kilo precision guided bombs, 3 times more powerful than the 500 kilo bombs that they were using before. Now, these are enormously powerful bombs. There is in fact no comparison between the explosive power of just one of these bombs and any artillery shell. And apparently, Dima is saying, and I'm sure he's right, that nearly all of the airstrikes on Ukrainian positions on the west bank of the Dnieper are now being conducted with these bigger bombs. And I suspect that we're going to see more and more of these bigger bombs used right across the battlefronts, causing massive damage to Ukrainian positions. I've discussed in previous programs the enormous damage that the Russians have inflicted on Ukraine's air defense system, how following the 3 big missile strikes that have taken place over the course of the last month, that air defense system has all but collapsed. And I would also recall something that I was told about a year ago for the first time from one of my correspondents, person in India, by the way, who made the point that if you want to destroy fortifications, and Ukraine is now trying to build more fortifications, as well as the fortifications that it has already established in the Donbass area, in which it built up over the 8 years prior to the conflict. If you want to destroy fortifications, the fastest and most effective way to do it is not with artillery, but by dropping big, heavy bombs packed with explosive. And that, it seems to me, is exactly what the Russians are doing and what they're likely to do more and more of over the next couple of weeks and months. No sooner do the Ukrainians build fortifications than the Russians will start to attack them with these types of bombs. And I'm going to say that we've had more news from other battlefronts as well. We're now getting reports again of more Russian advances in the Rabotino-Verbovoye area. Apparently there's 2 Ukrainian brigades located in this area, known to many commentators as Bradley Square. Apparently the Russians are now pressing the Ukrainians hard in this area. And of course, there was that report from a Russian reporter a few days ago who said that those troops, those Ukrainian troops in Bradley Square are deeply short of supplies and are, if not exactly surrounded, practically so. And there's been more reports from Avdiivka. The Russians seem to be in the process now. They're making a concerted effort to capture this village of Pervomaysky to the west of Avdiivka, and they made further advances up the railway northwest of Avdiivka, and there's now again yet another report that they've pushed the Ukrainians for the upteenth time from the village of Stepovoye to the northwest of Avdiivka. I'm going to just make a quick observation here about something that a lot of people are basing a lot of their reports from the conflict upon. An awful lot of reports, an awful lot of the guesstimates about where the front lines are located, about who's advancing and who's retreating, are based on videos, especially of FPV drone strikes carried out by either side. And what then happens is that people geolocate these strikes. This is a complex tool, geolocation, which I'm not going to discuss further in this program. Suffice to say that for the purpose of this video, I will assume that it works accurately, as it is always claimed to do. Anyway, people take these videos, look at where these strikes have happened, and try to come to deductions about what that is telling us about who is making the most progress on the battlefronts, who is advancing further, and such things. Now, I'm not saying that this is wrong, but I would say that I think this tool ought to be used a little more cautiously than I think it often is. I think, first of all, that a lot of these claims sometimes underestimate, as I said, how complex and fluid the battlefronts actually are. People talk about this being a war like that of the First World War, but it's clear to me, for example, that there is no continuous line of trenches such as one saw in the Western Front. The front lines, the line of contact, is too long and the forces too small on either side to maintain a presence, a continuous presence, right across every millimetre, every inch of the front lines. And inevitably, what you will find is that there's some troops who are left behind in some places, other troops who've advanced further. Troops from each side get muddled and mixed up with each other. That's the first thing I will say. The other is that I'm not sure that we can always tell exactly when some of these videos were made. So when one sees a line of tanks in a particular location being attacked by FPV drones or kamikaze drones, I don't know that that necessarily tells us where the front line is on the day when that video is posted, unless we can be sure of when that particular video was made. And on some occasions, I will say straightforwardly that I think that there are good reasons for thinking that a particular video has been made on an earlier date than the one it has been published, and maybe showing information that has by that point become historic. I think both sides do this quite a lot. I think the Ukrainians perhaps do it rather more, and I think we should be a little careful about over-reliance upon these videos. But anyway, for the record, for what it's worth, the latest claims are, again, that the Russians have pushed the Ukrainians out of Stepovoye. And again, there are pictures, apparently, I haven't seen these pictures, of Russian armoured vehicles west now of Stepovoye, many of them damaged and destroyed. Though, as I said, I'm not sure when those armoured vehicles were in fact damaged and destroyed, and whether indeed they even are Russian armoured vehicles. Let's put all that aside. But anyway, those are the reports at the moment. For the record, I don't think anybody actually controls Stepovo yet. I think there's a very tough encounter battle underway for this particular village. I think that the Ukrainians feel that it is a priority for them to prevent the Russians consolidating control of this village. I think the Russians, for their part, are prepared to go on attacking Ukrainian positions in this area, not necessarily because they're aiming for a breakthrough in this area or indeed in any other, but again because it plays into their strategy of aggressive attrition. The Russians push the Ukrainians back, the Ukrainians then counterattack. The village itself, Stepovo, is apparently largely devastated. There's very little cover. The Russians are able to then attack with artillery and drones and other machines the Ukrainian forces who are engaging in these counterattacks. The Ukrainians may recover some of the ground that they've lost, but always with losses that the Ukrainians cannot replace. So I think that is probably what is going on there. And again, there's been more reports from the Liman area, and I'm going to say straight away that I found these reports particularly difficult to understand. It's clear to me that there have been Ukrainian counterattacks in the Liman area. It doesn't look as if the Russians have pulled back in some places, but I suspect that they have advanced in others. Suffice to say that in one area at least, it does look as if the Russians are very much on the advance. This is the Marinka area. We're now getting more and more videos appearing from Georgievka, this village to the west. It does seem as if the Russians are methodically and systematically storming this village. It does look as if Georgievka is going to be under Russian control before long. And south of Marinka, the Russians continue a rather complex operation to capture this village of Novomikhailivka. They retreated from its southern outskirts about a couple of days ago. However, they seem to be taking steps to gradually encircle the village, and most people who have been following this battle closely, I think they're gradually coming to the view that the Battle of Novomikhailivka, like every other battle which has been fought on the battle lines, the trajectory again is clear. Sooner or later, the Russians will take control of Novomikhailivka. So with Georgievka, along with Marinka and Novomikhailivka under Russian control before very long, that will put the Russians in a stronger position where they can start operations to try to crack this major problem. They have long had Ukrainian control of Vuhledar further to the south, and Russians wanting eventually to capture Vuhledar because that will give them control over southern Donbass, and I suspect will basically collapse any future Ukrainian attempts to launch more offensives in Zaporozhye region towards the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea. So that's the situation there. There's also a lot of information from the Bakhmut area. I get the sense that there's a major encounter battle again taking place west of Khromovo. It seems that the Ukrainians are again throwing everything they can to try to slow the Russian advance towards this canal west of Chasiv Yar. I'm not going to pretend I have much detailed information about what is going on. But I suspect that eventually, again, the Russians, with their superior resources, are going to prevail. Now, there are a few general points I'm going to make about the state of this war. And one of them is about the technological balance. The Ukrainians have acknowledged that they have fallen behind the Russians in terms of artillery use. The Russians have far more artillery. This has been true at every stage of the war. Perhaps a brief period during the summer offensive, the Ukrainians had more guns than the Russians, or more shells than the Russians, or were firing more shells than the Russians. But at every other point in the war, the Russians have outgunned the Ukrainians by a big margin. And that discrepancy is growing, and before long, it is likely to grow wider still. And according to Ukrainian admissions, they're trying, to the extent that they can, to make up the difference in terms of artillery, their lack of artillery, with heavy use of FPV drones. And even Ukrainian officials have admitted that FPV drones are not a full or adequate substitute for artillery, but that is all that the Ukrainians effectively have. Now, I have discussed in many programs how the Russians are steadily producing more military equipment and upgrading that equipment which they already have. We've seen, for example, I've discussed, for example, over the course of this program, how the Russians are now using heavier precision-guided bombs than the ones that they have used previously. And we're starting to see them appear in used on the west bank of the Dnieper River in Kherson region, and most likely we're going to start to see them used in more and more places. But the Russians are also very busy, or so it seems to me, developing anti-drone techniques. Now, again, a lot of people make all kinds of claims about how the battlefronts have been completely transformed by technology, how it is impossible to conduct major advances because there are so many drones now which are able to observe pretty much everything and things like that. I think that this underestimates again the ability of each side, but especially the Russians with their far greater resources, to find solutions, technical solutions, to the technical problems that are being caused by some of the equipment on the other side. So Ukraine now is using many more FPV drones than it did, and these FPV drones undoubtedly are causing the Russians problems. And reports that I've seen say that FPV drones are the single thing that Russian soldiers complain most about. The Russians, by the way, have many more FPV drones on the battlefronts than the Ukrainians do. But for this purpose, for the purpose of this program, it's Ukrainian use of FPV drones to slow the Russians that is the issue. But of course, the Russians are almost certainly working hard to find means to counter this threat from FPV drones. And I've already discussed how they're bringing the new versions of the Panzer system into the battlefronts, how there's a tracked version of the Panzer system with its combination of cannons and missiles and radars, and this will be able to accompany advancing troops and provide cover against drones, kamikaze drones, and perhaps even FPV drones. But I'm also pretty sure that the Russians are working very hard to develop better jamming techniques to defeat the Ukrainian FPV drones, and more importantly, to distribute whatever anti-jamming devices they do develop to their frontline soldiers, to the soldiers even at relatively small unit levels. And we will be seeing more and more of that, I suspect, happen. And over the next couple of weeks and months, I personally suspect that what we will find is that Ukrainian FPV drones get increasingly jammed and become increasingly less effective. So, just saying this. Now, there is something else I wanted to discuss today, and this is that I received a very interesting, very intriguing email from someone. Again, I'm not going to say who it is. He has provided me with his name. I don't pretend that I am at all familiar with this gentleman. And this person has given me some information which suggests that he is actually well informed. Though, as I said, I want to say again, I don't know who he is, but I did find it intriguing. First of all, this person did take some issue with my description of Russian tactics as aggressive attrition. He said, he made the point that the number of troops that the Russians are deploying on the battlefronts is relatively small, which is absolutely true. And he said that this isn't enough for the Russians to be able to conduct effective attrition against the Ukrainians. Here I beg to disagree. We've had reports from Ukrainian doctors and even Western commentators and Ukrainian soldiers who've been interviewed by Western reporters. They all speak of very heavy Ukrainian losses. Ukrainian doctors are saying that Ukraine is losing around 30,000 men a day, 30,000 men a month, dead and wounded. That translates to around 1,000 men a day. And that does look to me to be very severe attrition indeed. It is certainly the case that the Russians have only deployed a fraction of their army to the battlefronts, but that simply shows how effective the attrition is proving to be. That's the first thing I wanted to say. Second part was much more intriguing. Now, this person has set out what he says was the American plan on the assumption that the Ukrainian offensive of the summer had been successful and that the Ukrainians had indeed broken through to the Black Sea and to the Sea of Azov. Supposedly, there would have been an American ultimatum to the Russians to stand down, and the Americans would have said to the Russians, if you stand down and basically accept that you've been defeated, well, we will allow you to conduct referendums in Crimea and the Donbass, and if the people there do vote to join Russia, well, we'll accept that, but it'll be limited to Crimea and to whatever area of the Donbass you still control. Everything else will go back to Ukraine. And Ukraine, what's left of Ukraine, will of course get Western security guarantees and will eventually join NATO. And the threat would have been that if the Russians did not agree to that ultimatum, then the Americans would have given the Ukrainians a green light to attack Crimea. Now, I think it is possible that some such discussion was indeed taking place in the United States in the spring and early summer. It is not inconsistent with some of the things that people like Richard Haass, for example, who was, or so it seems to me, at least in his own self-conception, trying to negotiate with the Russians in some way. Anyway, it's not so different from the ideas that those people have. Interestingly, it is identical to what that recent report by Seymour Hersh says was the discussion going on between General Zaluzhny and General Gerasimov in this supposedly secret negotiation, of which Seymour Hersh was informed by one of his American interlocutors. So maybe there is some truth to this. I ought to say that I think it myself that it is inconceivable if the Ukrainians had battled through to the Sea of Azov in the summer, that they would indeed have agreed to end the war on those sort of terms. Almost certainly they would have insisted on pressing on and taking Crimea. But if this is correct, if this is indeed what the Americans were thinking in the summer, then it confirms a point that the Russians have made before, and which various other people have made before, which is that this war is essentially a war over NATO expansion. Because if you think about it, this purported American proposal of the summer would essentially have been identical to the agreement that was almost reached between the Russians and the Ukrainians in Istanbul in March 2022, save for the critical difference that, according to the Istanbul formula, Ukraine would remain neutral and would not join NATO, whereas, according to this American plan, supposed American plan, eventually it would have joined NATO and the Russians would have been obliged to accept the fact. Well, I'm not absolutely sure about this. I'd like to know more from this person than just this email that he sent me. But I do think it is intriguing, and it does, as I said, give us some understanding of what was really in play here. I think that ultimately the Americans would probably have realized in the summer that they wouldn't be able to restrain the Ukrainians anyway. Probably they were expecting that the Ukrainians would press on and take Crimea, whatever the Russians said that they would do. And I suspect that the Americans also expected that at the end of that process, a defeated Russia would have gone through some kind of upheaval and the President Putin's government would have fallen. But anyway, there we are. These plans, of course, such as they existed back in the summer, have now had to be abandoned. On Sunday, we are going to have another meeting, this time in Davos, of the G7 states, with whatever global South states are still willing to turn up. Anyway, this meeting is going to happen in Davos on Sunday to discuss once more Zelensky's peace plan. I've already said that the previous meeting in Riyadh didn't go at all well. Given what's happening at the moment in the Middle East, given the bombing and the missile strikes on Yemen, I personally would not be surprised if still more global South states decide that this time they're going to simply stay away. But I will be discussing more of that in my next program. This is where I end my program for today. Thank you once more. Just to remind you that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribe Star, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop and get yourself the amazing things that you will find there. Our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you like this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. This is me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.